So moving on then in Kant, with his proposed solutions to these antinomies, the first thing that he wants to do is to point out that part of the problem is that there is a conflict here between the ideas of the reason itself, and the pure concepts of the understanding. So the understanding and reason are in conflict here in these antinomies. They're antinomies of the reason, but they're in conflict precisely because they don't match each other. The ideas of the reason here given are either too big or too small to fit the pure concepts of the understanding and hence of a possible experience. Part of the problem of the idea of the universe being infinite in time is that the concept is too big for it ever to be a possible object of the understanding experience of a concept of the understanding, and it's conferring synthetic unity on that experience. It's too big. And if we say that there's a limit to it, a first cause, a point where it began, then it's too small for the understanding because, in accordance with the principle of the reason, which always wants to move from the conditioned to the conditions, to the ultimate conditions, then the understanding will ask, well, what's beyond that? And so it becomes too small. And the same thing with its, whether it's infinite in space, the concept is too large. If it's bounded, it's too small because reason wants to know what's beyond that. And so there's a mismatch, and so forth, through all the antinomies. There's basically a mismatch between the ideas of the reason and the pure concepts of the understanding. The reason always wants to proceed from the conditioned to the ultimate conditions that make the totality of the series possible in an infinite regress. So it proceeds along a synthesis of infinite regress backwards in time. But now Kant says part of the problem, and one of the keys to what will be a solution to the antinomies, is to be found in his whole concept of transcendental idealism, which makes the distinction between the world as appearance and the world as thing in itself. Now, as far as the world as it appears to be, these proofs, both for and against, are very well grounded, but the world is something other than what we think it is, and we don't know what it is. But there is this concept that he introduces now, the world in itself, which is basically the cosmological equivalent to what he had introduced before as the transcendental object or thing in itself, which is forever beyond the bounds of our possibility of experience. And on the inner side, the transcendental subject, or self in itself, which involves the soul, which is also out of bounds of possible knowledge. So too, the world is a world in itself that is outside the bounds of the ideas of the reason, which tends to think in dialectical terms of either this or that. It thinks in terms of pairs of opposites, but the world is something beyond this. The world is a mystery. It's a noumenon, something that is outside the reach of the ideas of the reason. But the ideas of the reason proceed as though the world were a thing in itself, and taken as a sum totality of appearances, then if it proceeded along this infinite regress, it would either arrive at a limit to the world, or it would arrive, or the world would be unlimited. And so in terms of these regressions, Kant makes then a distinction which proves to be crucial to his solution to the first cosmological antinomy between two different types of regression. He says that there are two different types of regression. There's a regression in infinitum, or in mathematics it's a progression in infinitum, or a progression in indefinitum. So if I draw a line, a progression in infinitum suggests that the line can continue to infinity. That's in infinitum. That's in the idea of the line. It can continue to infinity. But in actual fact, I proceed in an indefinite manner, in an indeterminate manner, by drawing the line insofar as it pleases me to do so and then stopping, even though I know I could continue as far as I wanted to go. So there are two different types of empirical regressions there, or in that case, a progression. But in this case, in the cosmological arguments, we're talking about moving backward in time, so it's a regression. So I can proceed in drawing that line on the assumption that it could be extended forever, but in empirical fact, I only go insofar as reason continually urges me to go from one condition to the next in an empirical manner, such that I move from condition to condition as reason urges me to do so. But if I have the idea of the infinity of the thing as a magnitude, as a pure concept, a pure idea of the reason in my head before I start the synthesis, that's a wholly different matter. So there's a mismatch there between the concept of magnitude, of infinite magnitude as an idea, versus how I actually go about with my empirical syntheses, which is a whole different matter. So these two different types of regression are both based on the distinction between a kind of metaphysical regression and an empirical one. And so then Kant, after having made this distinction, comes back then to the cosmological proof that either the universe is infinite in space and time, or it is finite and had a first cause and definite boundaries, and says then that the problem then is that reason proceeds as though this could be determined. What it is a regression in infinitum, but it has the idea of these magnitudes. Either finite or infinite, doesn't matter. Neither one can ever be a possible experience. But they're held in the mind as ideals, ideas of the reason that are held in mind prior to the actual synthesis. And so what happens is that the reason thinks that it can continue to go backwards infinitely, as though the world were not just a mere appearance in space and time, but as though it were a thing in itself, and it can't do that. So it has to proceed in accordance with this empirical synthesis that I can find. If I find a condition, I can go back to the condition before that, and then I can go back to the condition before that, always in an empirical manner, as long as these are possible intuitions that are given to me in a possible experience. But I cannot, however, have the idea of the totality of space and time as a magnitude in any possible given experience. Those, whether the universe is finite or whether it is infinite, are not ever possible experiences. They're outside the bounds of a possible experience. Even though I can think them, I can think the ideas, that in order to assert them as actual scientific knowledge, they have to be given somehow as an intuition, and they're not. So reason then has a regulative principle, not a constitutive function. A constitutive function is how it pretends to proceed in the dialectical abuse, whereby it treats an object as though it could constitute what the nature of the object is. But according to Kant, it has only a regulative function. That is, it advises us in an empirical manner to keep going backward in time, looking for the previous condition in an empirical manner. And we can only proceed in that way. But the idea of the totality of space and time can never be given to us in experience. And so that's outside the bounds of any possible experience. Therefore, Kant's solution is that both thesis and antithesis, that the universe is finite or that it is infinite, are false. Both are wrong, because the world is a thing in itself. It's something that transcends the bounds of our human knowledge. It's outside the bounds of a possible experience in terms of those magnitudes. And it's not something we can ever encounter. Therefore, we can't say of the world whether it's finite or it's infinite. It's neither. It's something that we can only proceed in terms of an empirical regress, and that is how we can have and say that we have actual scientific knowledge of the world, but we can never have knowledge of its totality. There was an anecdote about Harlan Ellison, the great science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, who came into a meeting once when they were getting ready to do the first of the Star Trek movies, the Star Trek the Motion Picture, which actually turned out to be the worst of them. And they asked Harlan if he had any ideas about how they could do this as a movie, and Harlan said, well, imagine this. Let's say that the crew of the Enterprise is traveling through space and they come to a giant wall, and the wall extends to infinity in both directions, up and down, side to side. They can't get past it. So they shoot some lasers at it, and they blast it away. And there on the other side of the wall is the face of God staring back at them. And he says, how's that for a movie? And one of the executives says, no, Harlan, we need you to think of something big. And so Harlan threw one of his temper tantrums and, of course, left the room. But it illustrates the fact that we can only do this in science fiction or metaphysics. We can't do it in science. That is to say, encounter a possible limit to the world in terms of space, or a possible limit in terms of time, or whether it has no limit, whether it's infinite. We can't encounter that ever. There's no way to do that. There's no way to have scientific knowledge of it. This is why we have science fiction as the mythology of science to play around with these metaphysical ideas. And this might be fine for metaphysics, but it's not something that a philosopher can pretend to have absolute knowledge of, a philosopher or a scientist. And so likewise, as he moves in to the solution to the proof regarding the infinite divisibility of matter, or whether matter is made up of substance, there again we're transgressing the bounds of a possible experience. We could never arrive. If we divide matter infinitely, infinite division of matter is not something that's a possible experience. It's not something that we can ever encounter. Neither can we ever encounter the simple, since the very nature of matter is that it is composite, so the simple too would be made up of a compositeness as well, and so on to infinity. And we can never encounter atoms anyway, so we can never encounter either atoms on the one side in terms of the thesis, nor can we encounter or ever proceed to analyze matter, dividing it to infinity in the other. So both of those are also outside the bounds of a possible experience, and they both turn out to be false as well, since they treat the world once again ontologically as a thing in itself that we can have ultimate noumenal knowledge of, and we cannot. All we can have is empirical scientific knowledge, which does not enable us to step outside the bounds of those possible experiences. And so that's his solution for the second of the antinomies, that it too, the thesis and the antithesis, is also false. Now these two antinomies, the antinomy of the finitude or infinitude of space and time and the antinomy of the divisibility or simplicity of matter, are both what Kant calls mathematical antinomies. And they are such that the conditioned, the ultimate conditions which make the conditions possible, that when we encounter the conditions and we look for the ultimate unconditioned, the unconditioned is actually still part of the series. If we go back and we find a limit to space, that's still part of the series. Or if we find out that there isn't a limit, it's still part of the series. Likewise, with the intuition of an object, all the atoms, all the parts are given in the intuition of the whole object. The whole thing is right there in front of us. And so it's part of the series. And so, therefore, the unconditioned is homogeneous with the series. And it also turned out, as we saw, that in both cases, thesis and antithesis were both false, since the universe is neither finite nor infinite. It's something else. Matter is neither ultimately divisible nor is there a point at which we can stop. That's also false. But with the latter two antinomies that have to do with freedom versus causality and whether there's a necessary being or not, the unconditioned aspects of them that make the conditions possible are not part of the series. They're outside of it. Freedom, causality has to do with cause and effect. You have two heterogeneous things there. A necessary being is separate from his creation. They're heterogeneous. And it will also turn out to be that in this case, both thesis and antithesis will be true in both cases, since it is the case that there is both causality and freedom. There is both a contingent world and a necessary and an absolute necessity to it. So as we move next, in the next video, I want to pause here and go into the next video on the solutions for the what he calls the dynamical antinomies.